Chapter 8, Watch Out for Logical Fallacies. This is some of my favorite material. One of the big reasons I switched majors from pre-med and biology to philosophy. Hope you enjoy the fallacies as much as I do. So what's a fallacy? Herrick defines them as errors in reasoning that nevertheless may appear at first glance to be correct reasoning. And I define them as reasoning errors that are so common, they've been given names. Now, there are formal and informal reasoning fallacies. We'll introduce you to two formal, and then the rest will be informal. So if this feels a little bit difficult, don't worry about it. We're going to come back to formal reasoning later in the book, but see if you can get these two fallacies while we're here. And in the case of formal reasoning fallacies, the problem, the mistake is in the logical structure. It appears to be possibly valid, but it's actually invalid. And here's a primer in symbolic logic that we'll need later in the semester. That little arrow means if then. That little three dots, dot, dot, dot means therefore. If you ever see P and then that little arrow in a Q, it's a standard conditional. It means if P, then Q. Why do they use the letters P and Q? Something to do with a book about logic. Don't worry about it. There's nothing else special about it. They were just stand-in letters. Those particular ones, I don't know why. Just a book. P is the antecedent and Q is the consequent. So if P, then Q means if you have this first thing, the P, then you're going to necessarily have the second thing, the Q. Sounds a little bit confusing, but I promise it's not a big deal. These are two legitimate, valid reasoning styles. These are two forms of argument that actually work. And the first one's called Modus Ponens, aka affirming the consequent. So you start out with the conditional in the first premise. It says, if P, then Q. That's what that P and the arrow and the Q means. Second premise is P, and then you conclude Q. So for example, if I execute a perfect triangle choke, then my opponent will tap. This is something from jiu-jitsu or mixed martial arts. So you have that conditional. If you do this thing, then you'll get this result. Two says, I'm executing a perfect triangle choke. It means you're doing the thing, the antecedent, and therefore my opponent will tap, the consequent. That works. If those two premises were true, they would force the conclusion to be true if they were true. Remember, that's the test of validity. If the premises were true, would the conclusion necessarily be true? So this works. It's not fallacious. Second, modus tollens. This also works. It's called denying the consequent. And here you're going to say, well, in this conditional, you don't have the second thing, so you must not have the first thing, because you don't have the thing that would come about if you did have the first, and so therefore you must not have the first if you don't have the second. For example, same argument, at least for the first premise. If I execute a perfect triangle choke, then my opponent will tap. My opponent's not tapping, therefore I'm not executing a perfect triangle choke. If those premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true, because if you've got that conditional that says, look, if you have P, then you'll have Q. If you execute this perfect choke, then your opponent will tap. And if they're not tapping, that means you must not be executing that choke perfectly. And remember, this is just based on the form, the structure. That's all you're looking for in validity. Now, here are two fallacious reasoning errors, two fallacies. The first is called the fallacy of affirming the consequent. And you're going to say, look, I've got that second thing, so don't I have the first thing? And no, you don't necessarily have that first thing. So same first premise. If I execute a perfect triangle choke, then my opponent will tap. Two, my opponent is tapping, therefore I'm executing a perfect triangle choke. Before I explain it, you think about it. Why would that not guarantee that you're executing a perfect triangle choke? If you execute it, then they'll tap. They're tapping. So does that guarantee that you're necessarily executing that triangle choke? No, you could be executing a perfect armbar or a rear naked choke or some other type of submission. You could make them tap in some other way. So those premises could both be true, but the conclusion wouldn't necessarily be true. So therefore, it's not a valid argument for. The second one's called the fallacy of denying the antecedents. Here's where you say, look, that first thing's not here. Therefore, the second thing's not here either. But the second thing perhaps could be there for some other reason. So you start out with the first premise. If I execute a perfect triangle choke, then my opponent will tap. I'm not executing a perfect triangle choke. Therefore, my opponent won't tap. Before I explain it, ask yourself, will that be a counterexample? Maybe they're tapping for some other reason. So even if you're not executing a perfect triangle choke, maybe they tap due to stretch. You're hitting them so much that they tap out, or you're doing or something else. All right. Now here are some examples from other areas. So same argument form, fallacious argument form. If I rely too much on artificial intelligence, then my critical thinking skills will deteriorate. My critical thinking skills are deteriorating, therefore I'm relying too much on AI. Now, all three of those claims could be true. But remember, we're looking for validity here. We're looking for an argument where if the premises were true, the conclusion would also have to be true. Can you think of a counterexample where the premises could be true and the conclusion still false? Yeah, of course, you could. Your critical thinking skills could be deteriorating because you're staying up too late looking at TikTok since you're not getting enough sleep, or you're smoking too much weed. You're doing all sorts. Maybe you're doing any number of things that would mess up your critical thinking skill. Doesn't have to be relying on AI, although that will deteriorate your critical thinking skill. And the other fallacy, denying the antecedent. So if I rely too much on AI, then my critical thinking skills will deteriorate. I'm not relying too much on AI, therefore my critical thinking skills will not deteriorate. Of course, they could deteriorate for some other reason. Just because you avoid AI doesn't mean you remain sharp and have excellent critical thinking skills. So that doesn't work. Same fallacies, different examples. If I drink poison, then I'll die. I'll die, therefore I'm drinking poison. Well, of course you'll die. We're all mortal. We're all going to die. But are you necessarily drinking poison? Is that going to bring about your death? No, of course not. And on the other side, denying the antecedent. If I drink poison, I'll die. Same first premise. I'm not drinking poison, therefore I'm immortal. Of course not. Both those premises could be completely true. It could be true that if you drink poison, you'll die, which it is true. It could be true that you're not drinking poison. I'm drinking poison. That doesn't mean you won't die. And now back to the proper, legitimate, valid argument form. So you can see the difference because they're very similar. Modus ponens, affirming the antecedent. If I drink poison, then I'll die. I'm drinking poison, therefore I'll die. That actually works. So if the two premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. And modus tollens, also a legitimate, valid argument form, which just means denying the consequent. If I drink poison, then I'll die. I'm not dying, so therefore I'm not drinking poison. Yeah, that works as well. If the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. We'll come back to these argument forms later in the semester. So if that felt a little bit confusing the first time you've been introduced to them, don't feel too bad about it. Just think about the differences between the fallacious reasoning styles and the two that actually worked. Now, those are the only formal fallacies we're going to discuss right now, but we have a whole bunch of informal reasoning fallacies. And these are the ones that you're going to see in advertising, in politics, and social media, just in everyday conversation all the time. And once you become familiar with these, you're going to start seeing them everywhere. If you're like me, it's going to open your mind to the ways in which people make reasoning mistakes constantly, many times intentionally to mislead us. Ad hominem is probably the most common, and it's a fancy Latin term. It just means attacking the person against the man. So what it is attacking the argument's author rather than the argument. Here's one long quote from Herrick. For instance, a political figure gives an argument for some controversial bill, and then opponents attack the person's character, their associates, their circumstances, whatever, rather than the actual reasons they've given in favor of the bill, which is irrelevant to the validity or the strength of the argument they've given in favor of the bill. This happens constantly, all the time. Now, here are some variants of ad hominem. Guilt by association fallacy. I hope you like these examples. So this discredits an argument by tying its author to something perceived to be objectionable. So you say that meditation calms the mind and improves focus. That's what Buddhists do. Buddhists in some circles might be objectionable. If a person wants to be adherent to their particular faith and not do anything that might be considered dabbling in another faith, they might rule out meditation. They might deny the fact, or try to deny the fact that it improves focus and calms your mind, which it does, and it doesn't have to be religious whatsoever. But notice that they're trying to reject the fact or the argument that it calms the mind and improves focus based on the fact that Buddhists do it. Second one, you've argued that subsidizing student loans will have a net positive impact on the economy, but that's a Swedish policy. We're not European socialists. Well, the argument is, or a person's made an argument, they've offered some premises. I assume, for the sake of argument anyway, that subsidizing student loans would have a net positive impact on the economy. Well, even if that's a Swedish policy, and even if we're not European socialists, that doesn't say anything at all about the net impact on the economy. So criticizing it in this way, which is similar, very similar to the genetic fallacy, which we'll get to in just a minute. But notice that doesn't address the argument being made, it simply challenges its source. It challenges its association. And here's one more. Your argument that better border security would lessen the opioid epidemic is bad because Trump supports it. Well, in this case, you're assuming that the listener doesn't like Trump. And so if a person tries to make an argument that better border security would lessen the opioid epidemic by saying that a particular disliked candidate, at least in this particular context, does like it or supports it, doesn't say anything at all about whether it would actually impact the opioid epidemic. And you could insert Biden's name, Harris's name, or any politician's name, any policy, just because it's been promoted by or associated with a particular candidate, doesn't say anything at all about its actual effectiveness or say anything at all about the reasons that have been given in favor of it. You hear that sort of thing all the time. Here's another variant of ad hominems called tu fallacy. And it's just hypocrisy. So the hypocrite fallacy. Just because a person is a hypocrite doesn't mean their argument is crummy. We like people to actually walk the walk. We like for them to practice what they preach. That doesn't mean what they're preaching is false. It doesn't mean the argument is bad. It just means they're a hypocrite. So you have to distinguish the two things. So, for example, Al Gore or Greta Thunberg, they say that climate change is a serious threat to humanity, but they fly around private jets. Well, that may be true. Maybe they do fly around private jets, but that doesn't say, or that doesn't give us any reason to think that climate change isn't a serious threat to humanity. It doesn't mean it necessarily is a threat to humanity. It just means whenever you point out that they're hypocrites, that doesn't do anything at all to undermine their actual argument. It says that they have a character flaw, or maybe they've got some excuse why they do that. They try to justify it. But in any case, it doesn't address whatever argument and reasons that they've given in favor of the view that climate change is a serious threat to humanity. Pastor Joel Osteen says that we should be humble and give to charity. He lives in a mansion. All right, well, maybe he gives us good reason to think that we should be humble and give to charity. Maybe he bases that in the Christian faith. Maybe he gives a religious reasons in favor of that. And just because he lives in a mansion, that doesn't say anything at all about the actual argument he's given. Maybe he has some good reasons why he lives in a mansion anyway. But even if he doesn't, that doesn't address his actual argument. And one more, Oprah Winfrey says that better gun laws would improve public safety, but she uses an armed security detail. Well, whatever reason she's given us to think that better gun laws might improve public safety, we have to consider and evaluate those reasons and that argument and not the fact that she may or may not be guilty of hypocrisy. Okay? Appeal to the people. This is attempting to bolster an argument's quality by suggesting it's popular, related back to the cognitive bias of getting on the bandwagon. So here's some examples. The Dallas Cowboys are America's team. You should support them too because they're America's team. Everybody loves them, right? McDonald's, over 99 billion served. Doesn't mean their food is healthy or even tasty. It just means lots of people have eaten it because it's cheap. I don't know. Everyone knows we have the greatest economy in history. Everyone knows. Everybody believes it. Everybody's saying. Well, one question is, are they actually saying that? Another one is, could they be wrong? And speaking of that, millions of people believe vaccines are dangerous. Can they all be wrong? They could be. Millions of people believe the earth was flat at one time. So just because a view is widespread doesn't mean it's necessarily true. Appeal to pity. Evoking pity or sympathy in order to bolster acceptance of an argument. Here's some examples. Irene, the ice skater, overcame the death of her parents to train and compete in the Olympics. And that's why she deserves the gold medal. Of course, this has nothing to do with her actual performance, merits of her skating skill and the competition. So they're looking for sympathy. It's distinguished from the actual criteria you'd use to judge a skater. Here's another one from politics. My parents were poor immigrants who worked hard to give me a better life. That's why I know the American dream. I know it's real. And that's why my policies are best. They start out with this sad stuff. And okay, maybe you had a particular experience, but that shouldn't sway our evaluation of your actual policy positions. Or my son served in the military and died of cancer. That's why I understand the sacrifices of our troops and why my foreign policies are better than my opponents. Maybe this person's child did serve in the military and die of cancer. Maybe they do better understand the sacrifices of the troops, maybe, than their opponents based on their opponents' life experiences. But does that say anything at all about the efficacy of their foreign policy suggestions, whether it'll promote prosperity, peace, etc.? No, you need to evaluate those independently. Irrelevant conclusion, offering premises that don't actually support the conclusion. You'll see this a whole lot in many different contexts, but here's a couple of examples. So a moderator says, did you mishandle classified emails? And the respondent, the politician, the candidate says, I've spent my entire career fighting for women's rights and healthcare. Of course, my emails are fine. So this is related to a red herring. This is something we'll talk about in just a second, where you just throw out something that's irrelevant to distract, to change the conversation, to get it off track. Very, very similar. Here's another example. Interviewer, how will your new healthcare plan be better than your opponents? We're doing tremendous things. No one has done more for the economy than I have. My healthcare is tremendous. Maybe so, but did that give us any reasons to think that it's better than your opponents? No, irrelevant reasons. All right, begging the question. People will oftentimes use this inaccurately in the way that academic philosophers use it. They'll say that here's a particular circumstance, and it begs the question, or it makes us want to question this particular topic or this particular feature of it. That's not what begging the question is. What begging the question is, in the academic philosophical sense, is circular reasoning. That's where you use what's supposed to be the conclusion as a premise. Here's one example. Premise one, the Bible says that God exists. Premise two, the Bible was inspired by God. Premise three, anything inspired by God is true. Therefore, conclusion four, God exists. Why is that circular reasoning? Well, conclusion says God exists, but that's also the premise. The Bible says God exists. Okay, so you're assuming in the very beginning the conclusion that the argument is attempting, or at least claiming, to support. So this doesn't mean that the Bible doesn't say God exists. This doesn't mean the Bible wasn't inspired by God. This doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. It just means that this is a bad argument. This is circular reasoning. Those are not good reasons to believe that God exists. There could be many other independent reasons, but not that argument. And here's another example of circular reasoning, or begging the question. Marijuana should remain illegal because it's against the law. So it should be against the law because it is against the law. That's also circular reasoning. It's also begging the question. You need to offer independent reasons to support a law, not the fact that it's already the law. Perhaps some moral reasoning, some moral arguments from political philosophy, not just the fact that it's already legal, illegal, etc. Okay? Red herring. This is citing an off-topic distraction rather than engaging the subject at hand. Here's some examples. The professor says to the student, I suspect your reflection this past week wasn't written by you, but by an artificial intelligence bot. Unless you can convince me otherwise, I'm going to assign a 0. The student says, well, you assigned too much work. I have a job, you know. That could be true. Could be true that the professor assigns too much work. Could be true that the student has a job. The professor is asking about whether they wrote the reflection response or they had an AI bot do it for them. So that's just a off-topic distraction. Here you are talking to your roommate, perhaps. Dude, can you please turn down your music after 11 o'clock at night? I need a rest to do well in my critical thinking class. And your roommate responds, well, you know, it's really annoying. You take those long showers in the morning. Maybe we should talk about that. Ah, you hear this all the time from politicians. They call it pivoting. They're asked a difficult question about something they don't feel comfortable answering. So they pivot, throw out a red herring to try to distract, derail the conversation. Don't let them. Don't do this yourself either. The genetic fallacy, very related, very close to the ad hominem. This is where you attack the way an argument was derived, or its origins, its original author, etc., rather than the author itself or the argument itself. So here's an example. Of course, that bill is bad. It was first introduced by Democrats or by Republicans or by any disfavored political party. Does that mean the bill is actually bad? Its actual content is bad because it was introduced by a particular person or a party? I wouldn't think so. I wouldn't think so. Muay Thai isn't good for mixed martial arts, Muay Thai kickboxing, because it comes from Thailand, where the rules are totally different from the octagon, American mixed martial arts. Muay Thai is very effective when it comes to striking. You need to know wrestling and takedowns and sprawls and groundwork as well. But just because it came from Thailand doesn't mean it's not effective. It is one of the best striking arts. And I like this one. Teslas are terrible cars because Elon Musk is a jerk. Elon Musk may very well be a jerk, Doesn't say anything at all about the quality of Teslas. Maybe they're fantastic vehicles, maybe they're terrible vehicles, but that's independent of whether or not Elon Musk is a jerk. Appeal to ignorance. This is arguing that something is true because it hasn't been proven false or hasn't been proven true. Somebody says, oh, we don't know. So here's some examples. Well, it's not been proven that Tom Hanks doesn't eat babies. Or we don't know for sure that lizard people don't run the government. We can't know for sure. Or eugenics, that stuff that Frank Thomas advertises. And who's that other quarterback on TV that advertises to guys my age? It very well could boost your testosterone. No one's ruled that out. They haven't proven that it actually does either. The burden of proof, there's another fallacy called shifting the burden of proof. In the case of eugenics, it's on them to prove that their claims are actually legitimate. If you're going to make a claim about something that's outside of our normal experience, such as good old Tom Hanks drinks blood or eats babies, it's on you to prove that that's actually true. You can't say, well, it's not been proven false, and so therefore very well could be true, or that lizard people run the government. If you're claiming that lizard people secretly run the government, the burden is on you to show some evidence, okay? That's the thing that's outside of our normal experience. Straw man fallacy, very, very common. It's called straw man because you take an argument and you misconstrue it, you misrepresent it in a way where it's easier to knock over, as would be a scarecrow, a straw man. So it's misconstruing an argument, so it's easier to refute than declaring victory over the actual argument. So here's a podcast guest. They say, I think referees, on the Joe Rogan Experience, they say, I think referees in the UFC should stop fights sooner to prevent unnecessary brain damage. Say, for example, when a fighter can't intelligently defend themselves, and Rogan responds, so you just want every fight to end the moment someone gets hit? That would ruin MMA. They didn't say it should end as soon as somebody gets hit. They just said they think referees should stop the fights sooner to prevent unnecessary brain damage. Now, I know Mr. Rogan, I hope anyway, would allow this person to respond and clarify, but misconstruing the argument in this way, in bad faith, that's the straw man fallacy. What about this one? You want less pollution? Sorry, dude, Americans drive cars, not bicycles. Yeah, somebody wants to decrease pollution based on whatever strategy. Doesn't necessarily want people to drive bicycles just because they want to decrease pollution. Fallacious appeals to authority. Citing an expert on matters outside of the realm of expertise, overextending the epistemic value of their testimony into an unrelated area. This is related to a previous chapter. Here's some examples. My philosophy professor says that lifespan treadmills are the best. I'm standing on a lifespan under-desk treadmill. It's very good, but I'm not an expert on treadmills, so I can say that. But my attorney says that artificial intelligence won't impact the economy at all. Well, just because they're an attorney doesn't mean they're an expert on artificial intelligence or the economy, so it doesn't mean a whole lot. It's something to investigate further. Or my doctor says human-caused climate change is definitely real. It could be real, but I would go talk to a climatologist, not a physician, about that. It's just not their area of expertise. Hasty generalization happens all the time, drawing conclusions about a large group based on too small of a sample. For example, did you see on the news where an immigrant murdered someone in Texas? I swear, they're all violent criminals. How many immigrants are there? And you got a few examples, possibly, of violent crime, and then a person taking that and drawing this sweeping generalization, this hasty generalization about the entire population. Or did you see where they were interviewing college students about basic history and current affairs? Clueless. Those spoiled college kids are such idiots. You ever see that on the news where they'll actually go to college campuses and they'll interview people, ask them questions? I'm sure they have to pick and choose to find people that really don't know the answers. And then they highlight those answers in order to demonize that particular group. And they'll do it to lots of different groups, not just college students. But that's a hasty generalization. Or this one from perhaps your personal life. I hope not. You made a C in your philosophy class? I know you weren't cut out for college. Just give up. So in this case, a C in one class doesn't say anything at all about your ability to do a good job in college. And you should not give up just because you screw up a little bit. My goodness, please. Slippery slope. This one happens a lot too. Arguing that One thing will ignite a chain leading to a terrible outcome when it won't necessarily. Now, here's an example, and I've heard this many times. If you let the government cap firearm magazine capacity at 10 rounds, or if you allow them to ban bump stocks, or if you allow them to put restrictions on assault rifles, if you allow them to define the assault rifles, even that would be terrible. The next thing you know, they'll be confiscating all guns. There are all sorts of restrictions on firearms. I still have all my guns. You still have all yours. So it's not necessarily the case at all. iPhones have the best, latest apps. Without the best, latest apps, people will think you're a dork. And if people think you're a dork, you'll never get married. So buy an iPhone for a happy marriage, not an Android. Yeah, that's of course not necessarily going to lead to a happy marriage or preclude a happy marriage. Of course, if we don't switch to 100% renewable energy, the planet will continue warming. Natural disasters will worsen. Entire cities will be wiped out, and soon human civilization will collapse. That's what they call alarmist. 100% renewable? Maybe these things could come about, but that seems pretty extreme to say if you don't switch to 100% renewable energy, therefore civilization is going to completely collapse. You need to see some really good argumentation to make a connection between that and that. And maybe it would work, but you need to see the argument for that. False cause variant, a couple of variants of false cause. This one's called post hoc ergo propter hoc. You know, I heard this one before. Concluding A causes B simply because A precedes B. Just because something comes before another thing doesn't mean the first caused the second. So every time a UFC fighter walks out to country music, they end up losing. So country music must cause poor fighting. It's not true that every time a UFC fighter walks out to country music, they end up losing. Matt Hughes used to walk out to Hank Williams Jr.'s Country Boy Can't Survive, and he would just whoop everybody's ass. So not true at all. But even if it did happen some, it wouldn't establish that there's necessarily a connection there. Since we passed the plastic straw ban last year, crime rates have dropped. Clearly, reducing plastic waste reduces crime. Just because one thing comes before the other doesn't. Maybe there's a connection. You'll need some more reasons before you make that conclusion, though. After we cut corporate taxes, wages increased. That proves that tax cuts increase wages. It could have been a supply and demand thing. Could have been the effect of a pandemic. Could have been any number of things. There could be a connection, but just because this came before that doesn't mean this caused that. And similar, non-causa pro causa. This is assuming that A causes B when there's no clearly established causal connection. It's very similar to post hoc ergo propter hoc, but it's just the timing isn't necessarily the same. For example, inflation rocketed after the government introduced vaccine mandates. That proves vaccine mandates cause inflation. I guess that's an example, just like post hoc ergo propter hoc, but I'm not going to hold you responsible for these subcategorizations of false cause. But in this case, vaccine mandates didn't necessarily cause inflation. There could be a connection, but just saying this came before that doesn't mean there is. My vegetarian friend, they started eating meat and they haven't gotten sick once since. That proves that meat prevents disease. That's also a hasty generalization, one particular case in saying it prevents all disease completely, but there could have been another reason. Maybe they don't get sick, they didn't get sick before either. Maybe they've been taking vitamins, they started exercising, maybe they've isolated themselves, who knows? Or here's another example. I use TikTok to take study breaks and my grades are great. That proves TikTok improves grades. Yeah, just because you do that, you get the point. False dilemma, another very, very common. So this is where or the author tries to force a choice between two unattractive options when more actually exists. Let's say, look, you've got either A or B, and you see you're not A, so you must be this awful B thing. For example, you either support the war or you hate our troops. You hear this anytime that there's saber rattling, anytime country is in any sort of conflict, and people criticize the conflict, then someone else on the other side will say, well, it must be the case that you hate our troops. You should support our military. Of course, a person could criticize a conflict and still support the military. In fact, in many cases, the military members themselves criticize the conflict. Here's another one. You're either a loyal Republican or a gutless, wimpy, anti-America hating liberal. or you're either a loyal Democrat or a racist, closed-minded, greedy conservative. So here they're framing it as if you're either this, good thing or you're this awful alternative. Of course, you could be an independent or you could be a proper Republican or a proper upstanding Democrat. So it's not like it's either one or the other, of course. And here's another one. You're either a devoted, insert any religion or even secular humanism in some circles, or a moral deviant with a reprobate. And unfortunately, you'll see this quite a bit. People will say, if you're not a member of this particular religion, this particular denomination, or this particular a religious moral following, then you must be just an awful, terrible, evil person. Of course, you could be something else and still be a completely fine, upstanding person. I've met people from all sorts of backgrounds that have been fantastic, and I've also met people from the same backgrounds that were awful. Suppressed evidence. This is ignoring, excluding, or downplaying, or selectively presenting evidence or consideration. So fighter X has never been submitted, so his submission defense must be perfect. Well, perhaps that fighter has never fought a submission expert. Perhaps they've always fought bumps. And suppressing that evidence would be something that would undermine your credibility, be committing this fallacy. This weight loss supplement helped Susie lose 20 pounds. You can see that in an advertisement. And in the fine print you read, results achieved with a strict 1,200 calorie diet and intense daily exercise. So you're suppressing that, which would allow the person considering the argument or the claim the proper context to evaluate it. Special pleading. This is similar. Applying a principle to someone else's case, but making a special exception to your case. So here's the first example. Grades should reflect performance. You believe that, right? But I work so hard. This is kind of appeal to pity as well, right? I deserve an A, even if I did poorly on the test. So in general, grades should reflect performance. That's what I want everybody to believe about my diploma, my GPA, and everybody else's. However, I deserve it. Here's another one. Protesters blocking roads should be arrested, except when it's my group that does it, in which case it's free speech. Let them do the thing. It's a worthy cause, right? Another example. When my favorite candidate lost the election, it's because it was rigged. But when yours lost, it's because they received fewer votes. Or you can't trust the media. That is, unless they're praising me, then trust them all the way, right? Fallacy of accident, committed when a general rule is applied to a specific case that actually deserves special treatment. So trespassing is illegal. So firefighters should be arrested for entering private property to put out a fire. Okay, you got a general rule, but in this case, you'd want to make an exception, and a legitimate exception, similar to the school dress code bans hats. So the cafeteria workers shouldn't be wearing those hairnets. I want them fired immediately. Or the apartment complex rules say that quiet hours are from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m., so you should be evicted for your fire alarm going off at 11:30. Fallacy of accident. Bad title, but as long as you know how it works. You need to have an exception, or there's good reason to make an exception for a general rule that's being ignored. Equivocation, very common, unfortunately, sometimes on accident, sometimes not. This is when you switch the meaning of a word or a phrase because it's ambiguous mid-argument. Here's an example that I hope you catch immediately. See if you catch this one. Sure, philosophy helps you argue better, but do we really need to encourage people to argue? There's enough hostility in this world already. Now, how is that fallacious? That's right, because in philosophy, argument means a series of claims called premises intended to logically support another claim called the conclusion. It's not a quarrel or a bickering match. Instead, it's offering evidence in support of beliefs or conclusions. And so here, that usage of argue has been switched in the middle of the sentence, and so that's the fallacy of equivocation. How about this one? Only man is rational. No women are men, therefore no women are rational. Here, what word is being equivocated? That's right, man. So in the first sentence, the first premise, it's being used to refer to mankind, human beings. In the second sentence, now it's all about sex. No women are men. It's being used in a different way. And then it's drawing this conclusion at the end that no women are rational. That's equivocating on the term men or man. Here's another one. You have faith in science, so why criticize my religious faith? Think about that one. You have faith in science, so why not criticize my religious faith? Well, here the term faith is being changed just a little bit. So to say a person has faith in science, that might mean that they think that the conclusions drawn by the scientific method are more reliable or they're truth oriented. They're epistemically reliable. And so it's a faith in the sense that it actually has evidence. So when you have faith in, it doesn't mean you're taking it at face value, not based on evidence, but you trust it precisely because it's backed with evidence and a logical process. And so then when you talk about religious faith, that type of faith is something in which you do, in fact, take a leap where you believe something without adequate evidence. That's why it's called religion and not history, because there's not direct evidence or not enough evidence. The normal standards of evidence have not been met. If they had been met, again, it would just be history or science or something else. There's nothing wrong with that. It just means the way faith is being used when it's applied to religious is different than the way it's being applied when you say you have faith in. And last, everyone should be treated equally. You agree with that, don't you? So the government should ensure everyone has an equal income. Everyone should be treated equally. So the government should ensure everyone has an equal income. Well, maybe that equal treatment just means that people should abide by the same rules of work and finance and by the same laws and not have the same outcome of income. Everyone have an equal opportunity to compete and make money, but this doesn't guarantee an equal distribution or equal outcome. Equivocating with equal there. Fallacy of composition. This is when you're assuming what's true of a part is true of the whole. So a small universal basic income experiment in California helped reduce poverty in one town. That proves that a national UBI program would eliminate poverty everywhere. Well, it gives you reason possibly to test it elsewhere and see, but just because it worked in isolation doesn't mean it's going to work across the board. It worked in one little bitty part of a country, but that doesn't mean if applied to the entire country, it would continue to work. Here's another one. Jeff Bezos is a billionaire. He's an American. That proves America is a place where everyone has an equal chance to become a billionaire. Well, he's one example, but does that mean everybody has a completely equal chance? Everybody, regardless of their physical or mental handicaps, regardless of their parents, whether their parents were loving and supportive and mentoring, educated, fantastic, wonderful people that sent them to the best schools and encouraged them, versus parents perhaps that beat them and discouraged them and abused them in various ways. Of course, a person could work their way out of such a situation, but would you really say that they're on equal footing? They had an equal chance to become a billionaire. I wouldn't think so. I wouldn't think the fact that Jeff Bezos is an American and a billionaire would establish the conclusion that everybody has an equal chance to become a billionaire. Fallacy of division. So we had composition, this is division. This is assuming that what's true of the whole is true of the part. And here's some examples. Since Helio Gracie, Hickson Gracie, and Hoist Gracie were champion fighters, every member of the Gracie family, or see everyone that trains with Gracie Barra Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is very good, must be a champion grade martial artists. Well, the Gracie family may be good in general, and Gracie Barra may put out some good fighters in general. It doesn't mean everybody is a fantastic champion grade martial artist that trains with them or happens to be a member of the family. Maybe a clear example, Subway promotes a healthy lifestyle. Eat fresh, right? Therefore, everything on their menu must be good for you. Man, their cookies are so good. They taste good, but I don't think they're good for me. What about this one? The blank party supports something objectionable. Here you fill in the blank. Whatever party, whatever the objectionable thing is. Therefore, everyone who's ever voted for a blank party must personally endorse that objectionable thing. And you could even apply this to members, people who are actually members of that party. So there's a party platform and they've got something that's objectionable. Could you really say that every person who is a member of that party supports personally that objectionable thing? Of course not. Maybe they just think that that party's better than the other one. It's better than the alternative, and so lesser of two evils. I'm an independent myself. I don't think you have to choose one or the other, but a person could have drawn it. And they may be a single issue voter and say that I'm a member of this party because I agree with them on this particular issue, but not the rest of them. So you can't draw that conclusion, although people do all the time, but it's fallacious and you're going to be able to start seeing that. And last, the discipline of academic philosophy owns critical thinking. Philosophy department teaches it after all. Therefore, Pellissippi State's philosophy professors must be the most logical. That's actually a route. It's not a fallacy at all. Bonus tips, search logical fallacies on YouTube. There are lots of fantastic videos out there with cool examples and videos and better illustrations than I've given right now. So if you like this stuff, and I do, look that up. You'll find so many cool examples. This is something you can learn for the rest of your life. It'll be helpful in all contexts, maybe almost all. 2, use artificial intelligence to help confirm a suspected fallacy. So you've heard something on the news or social media. It sounds like one of those fallacies, but you're not sure which one. Plug it into your favorite bot and say, I think this is fallacious reasoning, but I'm not sure which fallacy. Can you help me identify it and also help me understand why it's fallacious reasoning? If you can name it, that's one thing. If you need to understand the deeper why, that's what's important. In fact, if you know the why and you don't know the name, that's okay. You'll need to know the names for purposes of exams, and it'll help you identify examples better. But ultimately, you just need to know why it's bad reasoning. Start calling people out tactfully when they make these mistakes. Yeah, I'm sorry, dude, but I think you're making this particular reasoning fallacy. I'm not sure, but I think you are. Be nice about it. But start calling people out and help spread the word. And last, and possibly most importantly, begin recognizing and correcting your own fallacious reasoning. We all do it. We're all prone to these errors, just like the cognitive biases. But now that you're aware, you can prevent it, you can minimize it, you can deal with it, you can correct it. All right, that's one of my favorite chapters. The next chapter is going to be on the internet, news media, and advertising. I'm not sure it'll be as good as the fallacy stuff, but I hope you like it nonetheless.